I always put color bars in first.
My name is John Strube. I was born in Lansdowne, Maryland, which is now a suburb of Baltimore, in 1927. I went to Lansdowne Elementary School, to Catonsville High School, graduating in 1944, went to Gettysburg College, graduating in 1948, and then went to the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, graduating in 1951. I was ordained by the Maryland Synod of the United Lutheran Church in America in 1951, and then went immediately into the Army. When I graduated from college in 1948, I had taken advanced ROTC, and I was commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry. Then I went off to seminary, and in studying at seminary, was in the reserve during that period of time, but inactive reserve. But in November of 1950, my senior year, my mother called me and said, "It looks like you're going to take a trip." And I said, "Oh, where?" She says, "It says here, Yokohama, Japan." I had received orders to go on duty as a second lieutenant of infantry in the Korean War. I went to the Maryland Military District and said, "Can't I finish seminary?" And after first saying no, they didn't think so, a master sergeant found a piece of paper deep down in his desk saying they could rescind those orders and delay my call to active duty until after I had graduated from seminary and been ordained. And so that is the story of how I became a chaplain. I went into the Army on the 15th of June, 1951, and was assigned to a reception center in Fort Meade, Maryland, and there I awaited getting all the paperwork accomplished and moved through the Army to be moved from lieutenant of infantry to chaplaincy. And this was not a transfer. They could not transfer one from a combat arm to a non-combat arm, so I had to be separated from the Army on the last day of July of 1951 and commissioned a chaplain, first lieutenant of the United States Army Chaplains Corps on the 1st of August, 1951. My first duty station was Fort Benning, Georgia. It was the largest Army post in the Army at that time, 55,000 troops. And when I reported into the post chaplain, he says, "I'm glad to see you because you're only the 5th chaplain that we have at this point." My first assignment was to the Combat Training Command. The headquarters was the 30th Infantry Regiment, where I served during the time that regiment became the first large combat unit in the continental United States to be racially integrated. Following some months in that regiment and the Combat Training Command, I was moved to the United States Army Hospital at Fort Benning, which was a 1,200-bed hospital, and in the days of the Korean War, we had an average daily patient count of 1,257, and it was just a priest and myself working at that hospital. A very demanding, but a very rewarding position. It was then that I received orders in February of 1952. I received orders to Korea, departed Fort Benning in March of 1952. Had a leave with my wife and very young son, and then went to the port of embarkation at Seattle, Washington, and all chaplains, all doctors, and all artillery first three graders were flown to Korea at that time because they were critical MOSs. We were flown to Japan by way of Alaska on Canadian Pacific Airlines, which we were really lucky because that was a regularly scheduled flight for them, and we had very good service. And then we flew in and went to Camp Drake, and then got on a train, went down to Sasebo, and took an overnight Liberty ship to Busan. We're put on another train. We're on that train for 36 hours, and I finally wound up at 7th Division Rear, where I learned I would be assigned to the 17th Infantry Regiment. After about 3 days in the replacement depot, those of us who were assigned to the 17th boarded trucks, and an interesting little story there. As we climbed onto the trucks, they said the last convoy was attacked by infiltrators, and so therefore we want all of you to have plenty of ammunition, and they threw ammunition on the truck. And of course I was sitting there with three infantry officers who were being assigned to the 17th, and they said to me, "Here, you load some weapons too, Chaplain." And so I was having been trained as an infantry officer, I was loading weapons too for this trip up, but it was an uneventful trip. We got to the 17th, I reported in to the adjutant, and the adjutant immediately called Chaplain Peter Van Dyke, Father Van Dyke, who was the regimental chaplain. He came and got me and took me to his tent there at regimental headquarters, and briefed me on the situation of the regiment. We were located in the Comwa Valley at that particular time, and he said, "You will be living with the 3rd Battalion at first." He pointed out to me that the Protestant chaplains would move from battalion to battalion, with 2 battalions up and 1 battalion back. We'd always be on line, and he would be at headquarters and be at the collecting point for casualties. And that's how I started my work. As it turned out, this was a very quiet time in the war, one of the very few quiet times in the war. It lasted a month or so.
But let me stop you one moment.
I arrived at the 17th Infantry headquarters in early May. I believe it was about the 2nd or 3rd of May, but I do not have that in my memory. And I was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, and the very first night I was there, I have to say that the chaplain always lived right next door to the forward aid station, or as close to the forward aid station as was possible. And my phone rang that night, and we had a casualty, an attached artilleryman out on the line in the sound and flash group, which sound and flash, they figured out where Chinese artillery was by listening to the sound with their instruments and watching for the flash. Anyway, he had taken a SWAT at a rat in his bunker. Unfortunately, he took a swat at the rat with a loaded Tommy gun and shot himself in the head. And he was dying in place. And so here I am the first night there trying to find my way out to his bunker. The medics got off ahead of me, and so my assistant and I were picking our way through the blackout to this position to get there just as the man was dying. The Comal Valley was a valley along a river. We were, of course, in the hills, except for our main line of resistance ran along a railroad line, and that was between us, of course, and the Chinese. And we had outposts on hills out beyond the railroad line. But we lived in the hills because the Chinese couldn't see us there as easily, and it was easy to get in behind in the reverse slope of a hill and be fairly protected from their artillery, but never protected from their mortar fire. It was beautiful country, I could tell, but it didn't look all that beautiful in those days because all of the hills, the mountains had the tops were all shot away by artillery fire. But it was not that hard to get around. It was what I would call a beautiful place, but no place is really beautiful in combat. During the very quiet times of the war, a chaplain would spend 1 day a week with each of the companies on line. And at that particular point, all 3 of the battalions were committed to the line, so that the other Protestant chaplain, Chaplain Don Lewis, and I would divide up the companies on line so that we would spend this day a week with each company. That day started by driving out to the company. I would spend the morning trooping the line along the fighting positions, going from fighting position to fighting position. There were bunkers along that railroad line, which man by men, we called them the fighting positions. And I would stop at each fighting position and talk to the men, just have chit-chat, see if they had any problems they wanted to talk about what was going on back home. You know, just the normal kinds of thing. If a fella had just gotten a Dear John, he would let me know pretty quick, and then we'd go off and talk in a more private place. But that's what I did all morning, and I'd say, having arranged at the company headquarters before heading out on my walk, I'd tell them what bunker at the headquarters that we would have our services, which would generally start right after noon chow. And the platoon sergeant would tell people when they could go back to the service, because we could never have a bunker that was big enough to hold more than about 12 or 14 people at a time. So I'd hold 20-minute services about every 40 minutes until everybody who wanted to worship had come back and worshiped. My assistant, in the meantime, would have set up our field organ, and we had hymnals that we would pass out. Most of the time we could not set up an altar in the bunker because it just took away from the room where people would be standing for the worship. But when we could get behind a reverse slope in other situations, then we could get into a position where we try to have a service outdoors, and more people could come, and I could set up the altar, and that with that kind of occasion, we'd have Holy Communion. The bunkers that I visited in or had services in were made with local material, logs, and we were very fortunate along the railroad line. We tore up the railroad, and the roofs of many of the bunkers were railroad ties, and even some of the rails the fellows found ways of cutting these rails so that they could be good for the roofs of the bunkers. Now, all of this, of course, was covered with sandbags, several layers of sandbags, because one thing that the Chinese were great at was artillery fire and mortar fire. And you had to have a lot of good sandbag protection. You could set your clock every night they started shelling us about 10 o'clock. But the bunkers were rough inside, but we didn't worry about that. They were comfortable from the standpoint of protecting us. In the wintertime, they were hard to keep warm, and in the summertime, they were hot. But other than that, they were great because they kept us alive. That's what the bunker was like, and that's what I spent my time moving from bunker to bunker and talking with the men, and then having services in a bunker. It was an interesting life in that situation. The morale, I think, was for the most part good among the men. They were always seemed to be full of good humor. When things were very slow, they would get a bit bored. Then when things would pick up, they wished it got slow. They would wish it got slow again. But they cared for each other, and I think that was one of the great contributions to morale. My experience of the men of the 17th, and I would think this would be true of most infantrymen, is that they cared for each other in a way that I wish we could make part of our lives in civilian life. They really looked out for each other. In talking about this being a quiet time of the war, I think I may give a false impression. A quiet time means that we were not engaged in a major battle, which we'll get to later. But every night there was patrol activity. At least one of the companies would be sending out at least one sizable patrol, or maybe several smaller patrols. And as war is, you generally are going to run into difficulty on patrols. Quite frequently, our patrols would run into an enemy patrol, and there would be a firefight, and there would be wounded. And this would generally occur very early in the morning. I figured I could sleep from 10 o'clock until about 2 in the morning. And that's when the phone would ring from the forward aid station saying, "Chaplain, we're taking casualties." And then that would be my signal to get over to the forward aid station, to be there when the casualties came in, and to offer my solace and so forth to the men who were wounded, who were being evacuated on back through channels. And that was pretty much every night. I figured that I would get 4 hours sleep a night, and then from then on, I'd be up with casualties in aid stations. Sometimes it was better, but most of the time we kind of worked on that schedule. Sometimes there were a lot more casualties than others, depending upon the size of the patrol, but we could almost count on casualties every night. And then on occasion, there would be what I would call raids. Our regiment would receive orders to destroy the fighting positions of the Chinese on an opposing hill. And usually one of our companies would move out and attack the hill, take the hill, and destroy all the enemy fortifications and then fall back. That would happen probably about every other week. And in that instance, we would have a lot of casualties. This was a very difficult and strenuous kind of combat that these companies would undertake. And we lost a lot of men in those engagements. Yeah, I would be at the forward aid station, of course, as these casualties were brought back. Since this would be a daylight operation, this is when we would call in helicopters for the most seriously wounded, who would evacuate the casualties to MASH hospitals. And I saw with the great medics who served in the 17th, working heroically to save lives in the forward aid station. I would sometimes be standing holding the blood substitute, the name of which I can't remember anymore, one in each hand, hooked to a man down near me, and I'd be talking with the men at the time, or kneeling and talking with them at the time, and then I'd pray with them. We saw all kinds of casualties, all kinds of wounds, and it was all the men were subject to being wounded. The officers leading were very subject to being hit and wounded or killed. I went forward. There were 4 of us on the truck. When I came up to the regiment back in May, and by July there were only 2 of us left. 2 of the officers I had gone forward with, one in K Company and one in Item Company, I Company, were killed by July. Each one was killed in June, and the other was killed in July. And I happened to be in the aid station. Now, when they went off on these raids, one of us would be at the main line of resistance, at the point of departure, at the point that they actually moved out into where they were sure there was going to be combat, just to give our moral support and blessing as they moved out. And then we'd go to the aid station. And one of the nice things that people have said to me, you were there when we moved out, and you were one of the first faces that I saw when I got to the forward aid station. And that always made me feel good. Of course, you know, our religious preference was on our dog tags. It made absolutely no difference to us when we were dealing with what I would call an ordinary wound, a wound that was not, at least, was not going to bring about death. But if it was going to bring about death, if the man was dying, then that became very important. And I would look at the dog tag, and if the man was a Roman Catholic, I would make sure that Father Van Dyke was notified that this man was being evacuated back to the collecting point where Father Van Dyke always was during an engagement, so he could give last rites to the man there. If we could not reach Father Van Dyke for some reason, he was engaged somewhere else, we would call division, and division, 7th Division, would send up a chaplain to collecting point for that duty. Otherwise, we cared for men of all faiths and religions in the forward aid station, doing what we could for them religiously or spiritually. I wouldn't say religiously, that was a bad word, spiritually, devotionally, in a time of great stress for them. The first regimental commander that I served under was Colonel Risdon, Bill Risdon, I think. It was William Risdon, a wonderful man, just a fine leader, a really fine leader. The battalion commander of the 3rd Battalion, when I was attached to them, was Colonel Spellman. And there's a little bit of a joke about that. The Archbishop of New York at that time was Cardinal Spellman. And so they never said it to his face, but whenever people talked about Colonel Spellman, they'd say Cardinal Spellman. But he was a good commander. I just can't say enough about the senior officers with whom I worked. And they all respected my position as the chaplain and fostered our work as much as it was possible in a combat situation. Were very, very supportive and used us, called on us to be helpful to them in making difficult situations concerning the welfare of individual persons or the men in general. I just could talk forever singing the praises of the senior officers with whom I worked. The other senior officers, the other regimental commanders with whom I worked was Colonel Royal Reynolds, who was the commander of the regiment during the Battle of Triangle Hill in October of 1952, and then he was replaced by Colonel Wayne Hardick, who was commander of the regiment when I rotated to come home in March of 1953. These were all men with whom I had a good relationship and who were fine leaders of men in combat. The big major battle in which the 17th was engaged when I was with the 17th was the Battle of Triangle Hill in October of 1952. That battle started when the Chinese hit us trying to break through a rock battalion on our left flank. At that particular point, I was living with the 1st Battalion of the 17th, which was the flank battalion next to the Republic of Korea ROK division on our left. They hit us with everything that they had, the Chinese, I should say. In fact, I have a little bit of humor about this. I was sitting out on the John, out in the wide open, as you all would, those from the regiment would remember, at the end of the day, and one of our observation planes flew over me out over the front, and as they got to the front, they started firing at that plane with everything they had. And I thought, uh-oh, they've got something out there they want him to see. Well, what they had out there was a couple of divisions heading toward us. And then I hardly got that thought out of my mind when the first round of artillery came in to soften us up for their attack. And I ran down to the bunker pulling up my pants. And that's how it started. From then on, we were taking casualties. They overran our 2 outposts out in front of the 1st Battalion, Charlie Outpost and Able Outpost. And we were evacuating casualties. We had to bring up men from the division band, actually. We were seizing casualties so quickly that men from the division band came up to be replacements, which was something to behold, and because they had never seen any combat. And in fact, I lost a good friend, a fine young Indian soldier, an Apache Indian named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had volunteered to go out and be a fire cover as the men came off the outpost, and as he dropped back into the trench, one of the men from the division band turned around and saw this little fellow dropping into the trench and shot him. And by the time we got him to the aid station, he had died. That was a difficult situation for everybody, including the man that shot him. As this battle developed, which we were calling the Battle of Charlie Outpost at that particular point in time, the very early days of what later became the Battle of Triangle Hill, that evening, late that evening, it was dark, midnight, the word came to us that the Chinese had broken through the Korean division on our left, and that we probably were surrounded. And here I was at the aid station, and with all these wounded, and we thought we had Chinese behind us. And so I went out to the dog company mess hall, and I rounded up the cooks and said, get your weapons, get your all the ammunition you can find. We're going to set up a perimeter defense around the aid station. Well, these guys thought that was not a very good idea at all, but they did it. My assistant, Corporal Scott, was an experienced infantryman, and I had training in this, having been commissioned as 2nd Lieutenant of Infantry, and we set up this perimeter of defense. And that was the only time that I ever strapped on my pistol. All chaplains in Korea had a pistol that was not ever official. But the point is, no chaplain survived capture in the Korean War. And I'll tell you that story at another time. But anyway, it was the only time I strapped on my pistol as I was setting this up. And then I went back into the aid station with my pistol on without thinking. And that drove everybody crazy. They thought, oh, he must be dead. The chaplain's got his pistol on. And so I quickly took it off and hid it. And as other wounded men came in, they didn't see it. But that never developed. I'm not sure what the Chinese ever broke through far enough, but the word was that they had that night. This battle kept going, and the pressure was not so much on us anymore as it was on the Korean division to our left. And the decision was made by 8th Army, evidently, that the 7th Division must do something to relieve that pressure on that Korean division, which would have given way. So now all 3 regiments of the 7th Division, no, 2 of the regiments of 7th Division were committed across the Kumwa Valley. the reserve regiment was sent then to attack Triangle Hill, a battalion attack at a time. And that became then a fierce battle that raged for days. I don't know exactly how many days. And every regiment of the division eventually was committed into that battle. We were the last to be committed because we had been involved in the beginnings of it, but we were relieved by the regiment that had made the first attack, went back, simply regrouped, and our fellows went up Triangle Hill, one battalion at a time, and I was at the aid station at the base of the hill. Throughout that, dealing with casualties constantly. And one thing I say about that, I would be with the men as they were moving out to go up. They were buffaloes. They looked good. They knew what they were going into, but they looked good moving out. When they came back off of that hill, they looked like zombies. The best way to say zombies. They were just not able to really react because they had been so overwhelmed under constant attack, artillery constantly up on that hill from the Chinese, and then bugle blowing infantry attacks against our positions. And the casualties were fierce. My understanding was that the 7th Division lost 5,000 men in that battle. I can tell you that the 17th lost so many men that we had to be sent back to guard prisoners so that there would be time to give us enough replacements to go back online. The other two regiments did not need that because they had foreign battalions attached to them. The 31st had the Colombians, and the 32nd had the Ethiopian battalions attached to them. But this battle, I can't describe the battle because I wasn't there. I was hearing it. We would get shelled periodically at the forward aid station, but the men coming off of that battle, coming down that hill, I'll never forget how they looked. They probably don't remember how they looked, but I do. And I knew that they had been through hell. And of course, I worked day and night with the medics, dealing with the wounded and dying. Now, all I know is what we were told, but we were told that in the Battle of Triangle Hill, the 7th Division had chopped up 3 corps of Chinese trying to retake that portion of the hill. 3 corps of Chinese, that would be at least 6 divisions were thrown at us in that. I would happy to say that it did what the 8th Army had intended. It relieved the pressure on the Korean division to our left, and the line remained stable but at great cost to the 17th and to the entire 7th Division as far as men wounded and killed. Finally, we just simply the 17th withdrew from the hill, and the battle of Triangle Hill and the battle then ceased. And as I look back on it now, I understand that the mission had been accomplished, the line had been maintained, the main line of resistance that had been established. The Koreans had been relieved, did not have the pressure on them, and the Chinese had given up trying to push through, and so that's how the battle ended. We simply withdrew from there because it was too difficult to maintain. And I can't tell you what, militarily all about it. I simply know how bad it was from the wounds that I saw. There were Chinese wounded brought in, and we ministered to them just like we did anybody else. It was very difficult because they couldn't tell us anything. They didn't know any. They didn't know any English, and we didn't know any Chinese, and we certainly didn't have any interpreters in a forward aid station. But we took good care of them, and they were evacuated through channels as prisoners. It was not a lot of Chinese taken prisoner. It was a kind of an intense battle, and that they just were not taken prisoner, not because our people were being that brutal, although I think some of them were, but because the Chinese commanders were so intent on trying to overrun our positions. Those men were committing suicide, not on their own, but by the order of the commanders, because the Chinese would come in before their artillery fire would lift. They'd be standing on our positions when the artillery fire lifted. And you know how many men they would lose doing something like that. So it was a difficult battle. And speaking of the Chinese prisoners, I have a little aside. At the beginning of this battle, as I described it over at on the left flank of the division, after forming that defense perimeter around the aid station that I had talked about, I was moving back, of course in blackout, to the forward aid station, and I stumbled over something. And I leaned down, and it was a young Chinese soldier. Now, I don't know how he got there. That confirmed for me that they were very close. But it may have been that he had been carried in and by Americans and put down. When they realized that he was dead, he was Chinese, and they had so much to do just bringing back our own men, they went just put him down and didn't tell anybody. But I don't know that story. But I leaned over that fella, and the first thought through my mind was, thank God it's not an American. And then all of a sudden, God hit me over the head and said, all I could think was, John, what in the world are you saying? You're a representative of God, and all life is sacred. And I leaned down over this boy, and he was a kid, couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17, but he looked so young. And I thought his family back in China was going to be suffering the same way that every American family that lost a son would be feeling. And so I prayed for them and then moved back to the aid station. When the 17th withdrew from Triangle Hill, we went back into blocking positions for just a bit, and there was a big meeting of staff, and one of the funny staff officers came back and said, well, we're going to get on a ship. And I said, oh no, are we going to make a landing? Yes, we are. And he was smiling all over himself, And I said, well, you wouldn't be smiling if we were going to be landing in North Korea. He says, no, we're going south. We're going back and guard prisoners. And so I went with the 3rd Battalion to Jeju-do. The 1st and 2nd Battalions, with Chaplain Lewis and Chaplain Van Dyke, went to Kojido to guard Korean prisoners. We were guarding Chinese prisoners on Jeju-do, an island in the China Sea, a bit closer to China than it was to Korea. And I kept wondering about this, and I finally said to somebody, what's keeping the Chinese from coming over here and getting their people back? And he says, just keep looking out to sea. So every once in a while I'd look out to sea, because we were right on the sea. And prison camp was an old Japanese air base. Anyway, beautiful location, looking out to the sea. And the very next day, I looked out to sea, and there goes the battleship Missouri. And with the battleship Missouri was about 3 aircraft carriers, and I'm sure a destroyer force. And that was keeping the Chinese from coming to get their people. Jeju-do was a volcanic island of a beautiful island of wonderful people. I befriended the Roman Catholic priest who ran a mission there in Jeju City. One day at the as we neared Christmas, early December, the guard at the gate called me and said, Chaplain, there's a bunch of gooks here to see you. And I said, now wait a minute. Number one, they're Korean people, but I'll be right there. And so I went, and it was 5 or 6 Korean pastors from all the Protestant churches in Jeju City. And they had come, and I took them back to my barracks, which was also my office. And they asked me if I would be the preacher at their union Christmas service on the 20th, which I did, and it was a wonderful experience to be with those people as they celebrated Christmas. We left Jeju-do right after New Year, and were taken back by LST to Incheon. We came into Incheon again on landing craft, and now this is January, and we had not been issued our winter gear. And we were a cold group of soldiers, and we were to get a train to get to the place where our winter gear was. And the men were all standing around waiting for this train to pull in, and trying to build fires and everything. And finally I went to regimental commander, and I said, sir, may I make a suggestion? Could we form up the men and just have them run around a little bit in an orderly fashion? I think that would warm us all up if we did that. And he said, that's a good idea, Chaplain. And that's what we did. And then as we were doing that, the train pulled in. And we got on the train, and then we got through our winter gear and moved up to the Chorwan Valley. And I can just talk about the cold in the Chorwan Valley in January and February. Never experienced anything like it. In my bunker, at night, the tent stove would be cherry red. I would generally use my canteen cup to rinse my mouth out after cleaning my teeth before I'd try to get a little rest, like the 4 hours I was getting before the next group of casualties from a patrol, and one night in 4 hours, that cup was sitting about 6 feet from the tent stove, which was cherry red, and the little bit of water in it had turned to ice in that amount of time. That's how cold it was there. But once again, our people took it, complained, but took it, and continued to do their jobs beautifully. Chorwan Valley was a great deal more active from the standpoint of patrols. Even though I thought it had been very active in the Coomwa Valley, it seemed to be even more active in the Chorwan Valley. And of course, now I know it was leading up to Pork Chop. But we were taking casualties every night, and it was a lot of hard work in the aid station for the medics, and a lot of time spent by me consoling and comforting people. One story, a young soldier was brought in, and I, like 17, and I helped to raise him up so that we could get his flak jacket off, and as we raised him up, he looked down, and he said, "Oh, they're both gone," because his legs were gone at the knees. And that was his first knowledge of it. And my work was cut out for me for a while with him. And that kind of thing was over and over again throughout my time in Korea, not just in the Chorwan Valley, but throughout my time at the front. And I have a great deal of respect for the men who endured these wounds and dealt with them so heroically. And I wore a field jacket that was bloody, not with my blood, but the blood of men that I held in my arms as they died. And people said to me, "Why don't you turn that field jacket in and get another field jacket?" And I said, "No, it was my honor to be with these men as they died. They're real heroes, and I wear their blood as a salute to their heroism." One of the most difficult jobs the chaplain has in combat is to write a letter of condolence to the next of kin of everyone who is killed in the regiment. We would divide up these letters. Chaplain Lewis and I would divide up the Protestants, and Chaplain Van Dyke, and then later Chaplain Rooney would take all the Roman Catholic KIAs. But this was a difficult chore to write to a family. We were not allowed to give any details of the death. That was handled by somebody else. We were simply to write a letter of our concern for them. Of course, I knew many of the men that I were writing about, and I could say a little bit something personal about them. But the most difficult thing about this thing was, once again, knowing how much suffering was going on in the family, and then having to type a letter. Now, these letters had to be typed on my field portable typewriter on a field desk in my bunker by candlelight at night, because I had no time in the day. I was out with the troops, and I had to make an original and 5 copies because it went back through channels. It had to be checked at every headquarters on the way back, and so that I wasn't giving away any secrets or anything like that. And it could have no strikeovers or no erasures. And invariably, I would get to the last sentence, and I would usually like 2 or 3 paragraphs, and I'd get to the last sentence and I'd make a mistake. And if you ever want to hear a chaplain cuss, that I would tear that thing out of that typewriter and have to start over. But I did it, and I did it not with joy, but it was a privilege to try to say something meaningful to the families who had lost a soldier in combat. And I've never met anyone to whom I sent a letter, but I hope they meant something. I'd like to pay tribute to the medics with whom I worked so closely during my time there. These men, doctors, corpsmen of all kinds, were absolutely selfless in the way they gave of themselves to care for wounded and try to save the dying out in battle and in the forward aid stations. I witnessed this day after day, night after night. I can't remember all their names, but I have one story that I think says something about how far I hope we've come in this nation since the Korean War. One of the fine doctors with whom I worked during the Battle of Triangle Hill was a black man, a fine, fine surgeon in civilian life. And during a break in that battle, I said to him, "You're doing such a wonderful job. I really appreciate it. And I hope these men appreciate it." And he said, "Yes, Chaplain, I am working hard." He said, "but the thing that bothers me is that most of these people wouldn't come to me to have their toenails cut back home because they're white and I'm black." And I think we've come beyond that in the United States now, and I'm happy about it. In March, I was notified that as soon as my replacement arrived, which was a custom there, not a custom, it was a regulation that a chaplain could not leave until his replacement had been there for several days, so he could show him his around. Now, that didn't happen with me. My man had gone home before I got there, but I guess they changed it in the meantime. Anyway, I got the notice that my replacement was on his way, and it took weeks. When he finally got there, he and his assistant, my assistant, was going to rotate with me, Corporal Scott. And the night before I was to leave, we had an ice storm. And I got a call saying they were taking casualties. I was living with the 1st Battalion. They were taking casualties over in the 2nd Battalion. And Chaplain Lewis called me and said he couldn't find Father Rooney, and they needed somebody to go back to the collecting point to see if we needed to get a chaplain up from division for Roman Catholic badly wounded people. And so this chaplain said, "I'll go." And I said, "No, you won't. There's ice on that mountain, and if you go off that mountain, I have to stay." So we went over that mountain in the ice, Scotty and I, driving into the side of the mountain, coming down the side of the mountain to keep us from going off the other side of the road. And every few feet going into the side of the mountain. Then we got to the collecting point. I saw the condition of the wounded, stayed with them, called division, and told them to get somebody to Med Battalion because our people were at least going to make it to Med Battalion and probably do better than that. And they got a priest there. And that is the very next day I left. And I was so happy to be going home. But I have to say, I was sad to be leaving my good friends in the 17th. And we went home by way of Sasebo, got on a troop ship in Sasebo, Japan, and about 3 days or 4 days out of Sasebo, heard the story of the first battle of Pork Chop Hill. And I knew it, I heard it was I knew it was the 17th, and I felt like jumping off the ship and going swimming back, because that was my guys in that battle. And I felt that I was deserting them by going home. But I got over it when I got home and saw my wife and son. But I still will remember always how I felt about the people I served with in the 17th Infantry.